So we're going
To look at England's efforts to colonize North America in the 16th century. Generally speaking, England lagged behind Spain, Portugal, and the rest of Western Europe really when it came to exploration. We want to keep in mind, though, that there were a number of preconditions for England to get involved in the colonization game, as I call it. So those preconditions had to do with five factors. There were religious preconditions, economic preconditions, demographic or population preconditions, political and geopolitical preconditions, as well as governmental preconditions and support from wealthy members of the populace as well. So those five uh, conditions were necessary for English expansion into North America. So it's important to remember the religious context of Europe prior to and during the Age of Exploration, or generally speaking, the 16th and 17th centuries. Um, Circa the year 1500 CE, as we said in the last unit, Europe as a region was politically fractious and economically poor compared to the other great empires of the day. There had been a little bit of economic growth due to increased trade activity and better maritime technology, and also more sophisticated banking operations after about 1200 CE. But for the most part, Europe was hopelessly divided, particularly when it came to its political systems. So throughout Europe, there were hundreds of princes and dukes that fought for power and for control over various regions, and not too many countries were able to consolidate their resources without some favorable factors. One of the few unifying threads for Western Europe was loyalty to the Roman Catholic Church. And as a result, loyalty to the church's leadership, or the Pope in Rome. The church was one of the few large and powerful institutions that survived the fall of the Roman Empire, and remained relatively stable throughout the entire Middle Ages. So, after more than 1,000 years in power by the year 1500, the church had become somewhat corrupt and complacent. For most people in Western Europe, though, the church was the focal point of their lives and what tied their communities together. There were some people, both within and outside of the Catholic Church, that were unhappy with the Church's operations, practices, and theological interpretations. The Church was extraordinarily powerful, proportionally speaking, much more so than the Catholic Church is today. Parish priests were often the de facto rulers of their localities. They had the ability to kind of cancel out or veto actions of princes and local noblemen. All activity that the church engaged in was to and for God, or so they said, not really for the people. So this was very clear in the way that priests operated, and even the way they performed mass. The priest would face the altar when performing a religious service. He would not face the people. So this they would also speak in Latin, which was the founding language of the church, but a language that by 1500 was long dead. Only priests learned to read and write Latin. So in Western Europe, people would attend a church where the priest would keep his back to the congregation the entire service and speak to them in a language they didn't understand. And that was supposedly for God. The entire church bureaucracy had become very inward and self-serving by 1500. You go over more of this in a Western Civ class, but the church seemed to embody wealth inequity. So the church or the cathedral in a region was usually the best and most impressive structure in area. It usually was the best building. The priests were typically the richest individuals in an area, sometimes even richer in terms of property and cash than the ruling princes and kings. In addition, the church taxed or demanded or extorted high payments from the folks who lived in a region in return for religious services. The most egregious of these practices were was the sale of what were called indulgences. So an indulgence was a pass, so to speak. The priests would tell their congregations that they had to receive an indulgence or kind of a pass to get to heaven when they died, or else their soul would linger in purgatory, which was an unpleasant spiritual realm between heaven and earth. And they would linger there, their souls would linger there after death for an indeterminate amount of time. Priests also told people that since they were such sinners, since human beings were such awful sinners, they would probably be there in purgatory for near eternity. So if you didn't have an indulgence or this kind of pass key into heaven, you would be stuck in purgatory for essentially your entire existence in the afterlife, or eternity, so to speak. Even worse, priests told you that your family members that had passed on already, your parents, your grandparents, they were in purgatory and stuck there. So if you wanted to spare yourself and your dead parents or grandparents from near eternal suffering, you had to purchase an indulgence for each of them. The church would continually increase the prices of these indulgences. Most of the money did not go to serving the community. Instead, most of the money gained from the sale of indulgences was used to enrich the parish priest, the bureaucracy of the bishops and archbishops, all the way to the Pope in Rome, in addition to building the magnificent medieval-era cathedrals and religious monuments that we associate with Europe. Someone who disagreed with the church's operations very vehemently was a priest from a city-state in Germany. At that time, there was no such thing as Germany. In the 1500s, what is now Germany was at that time a collection of city-states, hundreds of city-states that spoke German dialects. This priest from southern Germany was named Martin Luther. So Luther believed the church had to reform its corrupt practices. And in 1517, he posted his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. The cathedral in Wittenberg is pictured here. In that document that he posted at the door, the 95 Theses, he laid out his criticisms of the church. In particular, he criticized the corruption of the church and the sale of indulgences, but did so under a very radical set of suggestions. So these suggestions were the following. 1. The church should be focused on the good of living people, not just their souls after death. 2. That the Bible should be read and studied by people themselves, which meant that the Bible should be translated into the vernacular of the region, and the priests should give Mass in the vernacular or the local language. 3. That you did not need indulgences or special help to get into heaven. Instead, you only needed what Luther called, quote, justification by faith, unquote. So faith alone, not the cumulative effect of the works done in your life or the indulgences you buy or whatever that were certified by a priest, your faith got you into heaven, not the accumulation of these works and pass keys that you buy. So the church obviously didn't like these ideas, and because this directly threatened the power structure of Europe. So very quickly, though, those secular leaders, various princes who were unhappy with the church, who maybe weren't in with their local priest or with their local bishop or archbishop, those princes and local noblemen, they began to take the side of Martin Luther because they wanted to take more power back from the church, which had become so powerful by 1500. So very quickly throughout the continent after 1517, various political leaders chose sides between the church, being loyal to the church, or sometimes they chose the Protestant side or Luther's side. And those princes, etc., who chose sides ended up going to war with each other over these disputes. So this began a period known of as the, quote, Reformation, or Wars of Religion, which raged on for more than a century afterward. And all of Europe at one point or another was engulfed in war during this next 100 to 150 years. Not quite 150, about 130 years. So everyone took sides one way or another. You either took the church's side and you were loyal to the church, or you took the Protestant side and you agreed with Luther's ideas. So even within the Protestant factions, though, sometimes there was fighting. But generally speaking, the Protestant factions fought with the factions loyal to the church. So the fact that there was a Reformation at all was a very important condition for English colonization, because without these religious changes in Europe, a push factor would not have existed for many people, particularly English people, who became involved in the reform ideas regarding Christianity. There's Martin Luther there. Another important figure in the Reformation was John Calvin. So Luther created an opening for many people to reinterpret Christianity in Western Europe. John Calvin was one of those people. So Calvin was French, but his ideas he was a French theologian, his ideas became controversial since France was, the King of France was loyal to the church. So they kicked Calvin out, and while Calvin was in exile in Geneva, Switzerland, where he spent most of the later part of his life, he wrote a book called The Institutes of Christian Religion in 1536. In this book, The Institutes of Christian Religion, he set forth a very stern and strict doctrine. In this, all people, he taught, were damned by Adam's original sin. But the sacrifice of Jesus made possible the redemption of those whom God had elected. And thus God had predestined to salvation this group of elected people from the beginning of time. Predestination was uncompromising, but it was part of the infinite wisdom of God that Calvin said was beyond human understanding. So Calvin argued that strict morality and hard work were what God valued, no matter what particular work that might be, whether it was menial or whether it was intellectual or whatever. Hard work and morality were what indicated that you were one of the predestined. Calvin's values influenced various churches around Europe, the German Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, Presbyterians in Scotland, and in particular some Puritans in England, as well as French Huguenots or French Protestants. Calvin insisted that individual believers have some measure of freedom to engage in their efforts to become more moral and work harder. So his belief in the freedom of individual believers and his recognition that monarchs and political leaders were also sinful like everyone else helped contribute to evolving political ideas in Europe. So these changes due to the Reformation in the intellectual climate, in the way you interpret the Bible, in people taking sides with the church or against the church, and people taking an interest in these new interpretations of the Bible, like Calvin. All these were really important conditions that allowed or pushed England toward colonization in the 16th century. So religious conflicts that occurred within Europe caused a number of groups to seek refuge or opportunity outside Europe.